And I'll say hello and welcome to Mark Taylor as well. Mark from the University of Sheffield, who we're all here to hear today. And Mark, I'll let you introduce yourself like a bit fully a bit later. But yeah, Mark has done a huge amount of work over the years, all looking at kind of well, lots of issues kind of pertinent to the sector, and particularly for us, a lot of work helping and thinking through workforce data for the region as well, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Um, but just before we get into that, I wanted to sort of just position this a little bit and explain a bit why we're sort of doing some of this work. I mean, obviously, we're really interested in who's working in the sector in the region, and one of the things that we're really focused on, or one of the things that we're delivering at the moment, is looking at creating a cultural workforce strategy for the region as well. So, the idea for this, and really was thinking about. Oh, hi, Lara. Nice to see you. um, was thinking about kind of who was making up the workforce, kind of looking at kind of the different jobs, levels, roles, skills, where they sit within the region, but also looking at and really starting to understand people's kind of protected characteristics and identities within that, so we can start to really build up a picture of both who sits within the workforce, the types of work they do, but also with a bit of a view to thinking about, well, what does the sector really need in terms of its jobs and the skills that are kind of required by the sector in the future. So we've been working kind of alongside this process and informed by some of the data that Mark has been doing in some really early scoping work with different partners from across the sector, with an organisation called Innovation Unit as well, to look at the development of this workforce strategy and thinking about what it should be. We haven't, we're not quite at the phase of publishing it, but we're just kind of moving into the final stages of this piece of work, really, where we've done a lot of work speaking to the sector, and we've kind of got 5 key elements that we think are really important for a workforce strategy at the moment. But it is important to say, I think where we're at with it at the moment is thinking of it less like a big sort of document and a research report, and actually thinking about, well, actually what kind of action can we take in the short to medium term to actually kind of think about starting to affect some change as well in terms of workforce. So the 5 elements that we're really starting to look at, and this will be you're kind of getting a bit of a sneak peek or an under the hood of it, are around growing vibrant local cultural learning ecosystems. And some of this won't be that surprising to some people on the call here as well, I should say. Nurturing young creatives where they live and learn. So really thinking about actually making sure that there are opportunities here within the region to both grow and develop their careers within the region and not have to move outside of it as well. Looking at modelling new routes into employment and leadership. And I think, we know the sector is also doing a lot of work on that already. Another key part actually is around facilitating learning networks for development and support. I think the crew is one really good example of this, but obviously this needs to exist and work in much wider ways across the sector. And also being able to really tell kind of compelling stories of career success and opportunity across the region. So being able to kind of platform and celebrate the creative work that happens here, that has kind of been started here in the region. And it is wonderful to see so many people in the room that are involved in and doing this work already, I should say as well. Um, Cool. Well, with that all over, my bit of waffle done, I'm going to hand over to Mark in a second. We're going to have about 20 minutes or so of Mark giving a presentation, and we've got plenty of time for questions. One thing to say in advance of that, actually, as well, with the data, is that we are working on kind of a final draft of the report that we're looking at kind of regional level. All of the data that we're talking about today will also be able to cut in various different ways that might be relevant to your organisation, whether that's around kind of art form or place as well. So the questions that you're kind of asking today and any feedback that you have will really help us to shape, I think, what those final outputs will look like in a couple of weeks' time. And if you're subscribed to our newsletter, you'll get those as well. But yeah, do just remember at the moment, this is kind of very much about the regional picture, because there's a lot of nuance and detail at local level as well, and at art form level. But Mark will talk about all of that in a lot more detail. Mark, shall I pass over to you?
Great, thanks very much, Anthony. I will now attempt to share some slides. Could you, Anthony, confirm that you can both hear me and see a slide that says the West Midlands cultural workforce?
All there, all good. Thanks, Mark.
That is what I like to hear. Good morning. Thank you very much, everybody. My name is Mark Taylor. My pronouns are he and him. I work at the University of Sheffield, where I am a senior lecturer in quantitative methods. As Anthony says, I spend a lot of my time thinking about cultural workforces. I should flag I am not myself a cultural worker. I am also, more significantly for this conversation, not a resident of the West Midlands. So I'm going to say a few things about the West Midlands cultural workforce, but this should all be in the context of the tremendous expertise in the room. As Anthony says, we've put quite a lot of work into this, but this is not supposed to be a final product, which is locked in. We're really keen to get any feedback on anything that we're talking about today. So to give you a bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about for the next 20-ish minutes, the main thing is to give you an overview of who the cultural workers of the West Midlands are. In order to do that, I'm going to talk both about how the cultural workers of the West Midlands are different from everyone else in the West Midlands. I'm also going to talk about how the cultural workers of the West Midlands are different from, or indeed similar to, the cultural workers in other parts of the country. I am keeping an eye on the chat to the best of my ability. If you want to stop me or ask for any clarifications, that is probably the best way to do it while I'm presenting. There's obviously time for a Q&A towards the end. Before I get into those issues, those questions of who the cultural workers of the West Midlands are, I'll do a bit of clarification around what I mean by the West Midlands, what I mean by the cultural workforce. And yes, you'll get a copy of the slides. So I'll start with a bit of context. I imagine that everyone in this room is relatively familiar with this, but for the avoidance of doubt, when I say the West Midlands, I am using it in the context of how the Office, I promise I can say this, the Office for National Statistics defines the West Midlands, which is the 30 local authorities in pink on the left-hand map. In case anyone is curious, if you zoom in on those local authorities, you can see there is a smaller number of local authorities in the West Midlands Combined Authority, which I've included in blue. But for the majority of the presentation today, what I am going to be talking about is all of the local authorities that I have highlighted here. So when I am talking about the cultural workforce, this is derived from the 2021 census. If you lived in England and Wales, or England, Wales, or Northern Ireland in 2021, or indeed if you lived in Scotland in 2022, then you probably filled this thing out. It might not have been in exactly the format that I've presented it here, but you were probably asked quite a lot of questions about yourself, including things like what kind of household you lived in, whether you lived in the same place as you did 12 months ago. But crucially, for the what I'm going to present on now, you were probably asked some questions about how you spent your time. So starting with this first question of whether you were employed, for those people who said, yes, I am employed, people were then asked, what is your job title, and what are the main things that you do in your job? And so I mentioned this specifically because I am talking about occupations. Talking about the creative workforce, I am thinking about, for example, people who are working as actors or artists or musicians or producers or lots of different roles like that, as opposed to people who work in a creative industry. So, for example, if you are so people who are working in like design role, like if you're an actor who works in corporate training, you make those videos to help people with fire safety or with occupational health, then you are included. If you are a person who works in finance in a theatre, then you are not included. This is largely just for fairly dry technical reasons about the level of precision at which we can understand these different roles. And speaking of dry technical descriptions, this is based on what's called the Standard Occupational Classification Scheme, or SOC. This is a scheme that has increasing levels of detail. So, for example, if you are an artist, then that is something that is defined at a 4-digit level as artist, but you're also part of a family of occupations called artistic, literary, and media occupations, itself part of a family called culture, media, and sports occupations, and so on. Promise this is going somewhere. And the way that we get from what somebody put in that box that I showed you into these categories is a bit of a mixed bag. If you put artist, we can be pretty confident that you have been classified into this code that encompasses artists. If you put that you were a creative producer, it's a little bit more ambiguous. You were probably classified in a role that includes film and telly, but creative producers, obviously, there are people called creative producers doing lots of different kinds of work. So it can feel a little more ambiguous. The occupations that I'm going to talk about today are the ones that I've included on this slide. So effectively, this is a question of you have to draw a line somewhere. If you feel like you are not represented, or the people that you work with are not represented by the occupations that I have included on this slide, that is fair enough. There are two possible reasons for this. One of those reasons is that you feel like you and I might have drawn these boundaries in different places. There are pros and cons. This isn't a classification that's been used elsewhere, but I'm not going to pretend that it's the only classification that is legitimate. The other possible explanation is that there might not be a specific code for the occupation that you are interested in. A good example of this is that there is not a code for video game designers. Video game designers are included in a broader family of occupational codes around IT and software, which would not be my first choice, but we are where we are. And so for some of the slides that I'm going to show you, I'm able to go into this level of precision. So for example, I'm going to be able to tell you how the numbers of people in these occupations varies across the different local authorities of the West Midlands. What I'm not going to be able to do is go into the same level of detail in terms of demographics, basically because this is potentially disclosive. If we are going to this level of detail in terms of occupations, I can't tell you about smaller demographics. But what I can do is tell you about the same occupations to a slightly more coarse level of detail. This is obviously introduced a bit less precision. We lose this category, for example, of managers and directors in the creative industries because they're grouped into managers rather than creative professionals. But this is just to give you a little bit of context of the numbers that I'm about to show you. This is what they are based on. And in order to summarize what the next section is going to present, I'm going to show you the percentages of people working in different cultural occupations, which are those occupations that I just showed you, where in the West Midlands those people are, and then finally, how their characteristics differ from other parts of England and Wales. So for example, in a couple of slides' time, I'm going to show you how many creative workers, cultural workers in the West Midlands are men, and I'm going to contrast that with how many creative workers in other parts of England and Wales are men. And I'm also going to contrast it with how many people in the West Midlands working in other jobs are men. In order to completely scoop myself, the West Midlands has a smaller percentage of people working in cultural occupations than other parts of the country. That is an effect that is basically driven by London, which has a much, much larger percentage of people working in these occupations than other parts of the country. I live in Yorkshire. We look quite similar to you. Where exactly in the West Midlands they are varies quite a bit. And that also varies quite a bit by specific occupations. It's not the case that the places, for example, with the most artists are also the places with the most musicians. The cultural workers of the West Midlands look quite different from people in other jobs in the West Midlands, but that pattern is pretty similar to what you see elsewhere. It is not as if in other parts of the country, the cultural workforce is representative of the population in which it finds itself. There's one exception, and I will let myself have that one little bit of theatre in keeping it behind. So, to start off with, in the West Midlands, what I'm going to show you now, so this is a consistent visual language all the way through. The numbers that correspond to blue bars are the figures for the West Midlands, whereas the numbers in the pinkish bars are the rest of England and Wales. Across England and Wales, the most common one of these occupations is people working as arts officers, producers, and directors, which is about 0.3% of people in work. That figure is about 3 times the equivalent figure for the West Midlands. That's also one of the most extreme differences that we see. There's something similar for newspaper editors, which is this factor of 3. But otherwise, if you look at occupations like artists, about 0.11% of people in the West Midlands working in the West Midlands are artists, compared with 0.18% of people in the rest of England and Wales. Librarians, it's about the same. Dancers and choreographers, it's about the same. But in general, you see this pattern where roughly the percentages of people working in cultural occupations in the West Midlands is about half that of the equivalent in other parts of the country. This is where they are, and I need to talk about this in 2 ways. On the left-hand side, we can see the percentages of people in the West Midlands, in each of the local authorities in the West Midlands who are working in these occupations. And for clarity, that's of everybody who's working. So if there are areas with a larger number of children or retired people, for example, that doesn't affect these overall percentages. And so it's actually in Warwickshire where the percentages are the highest, and also parts of the West Midlands that are on the Welsh border. In Warwickshire, Stratford, we're looking at 2-ish% of people in work, which is above the national average. However, it will not come as a surprise to anyone in this room. West Midlands is a lot of people. There's a lot of people in Birmingham, and the Birmingham has the largest number of people working in these occupations. This varies quite a lot according to which occupation you are looking at. On the left-hand side, we are looking at the percentages of people in each of these local authorities who are authors. On the right-hand side, you can see this group that I described, managers and directors in the creative industries. And I want to draw your attention to the differences in Birmingham. In places like Stratford and Warwickshire, you see the patterns are relatively similar. In Herefordshire, for example, they're quite different. It's got quite a lot of quite a lot of authors, relatively fewer managers and directors in the creative industries. In Birmingham, the pattern is the opposite, where there's not so many authors proportionally, but there's quite a few people working as managers and directors in the creative industries. So at this point, I will start telling you a little bit more about some of these differences as I described, comparing the West Midlands creative workforce with that in other parts of the country. I'll start by telling you a bit about people's patterns of work. So it will, I think, not come as a surprise to anyone here that people working cultural jobs are quite a bit more likely to be freelance than people working in other jobs. So with about 56-ish% of people in arts and cultural jobs being self-employed, compared with 13-ish% elsewhere. That pattern is almost identical in the West Midlands and other parts of the country.
Like a whole thing to upload.
Hang on, I can hear somebody talking. If that's deliberate, great. If not, I should feel like I should probably let you know. This varies a little bit by the specific occupations that we're looking at, but not really. In almost everywhere, people, the creative workers of the West Midlands are a tiny bit less likely to be freelancers, but there's really no significant differences to speak of. There are quite a lot of differences according to which bit of the West Midlands we are looking at. In Herefordshire, about 2/3 of cultural workers are freelancers, compared with about half of people in Redditch. But to be honest, that is largely a function of the kinds of creative workers that we are looking at. Almost all artists are freelancers, for example. So now we'll start getting into some of these demographic questions a little bit more. There's quite a few of these. As I mentioned, the story is going to be relatively similar as I keep talking, where the differences between the West Midlands and other parts of the country in terms of its creative workers are largely reflexive of the differences that you see in other parts of the country. And we'll start with one where that is very emphatically the case. About 53% of people working in arts and cultural jobs are men. That's true in the West Midlands as it is in other parts of the country. Arts and cultural jobs are a little bit more male than other jobs. Arts and cultural jobs, people are more likely to be in the 25 to 34 age group than other age groups. There's actually slightly fewer arts and cultural workers who are 16 to 24 compared with other jobs, but a lot of that is reflexive of the fact that people working in arts and cultural jobs are likely to go to university and so are less likely to be working when they're in the younger half of this window. Hold that thought, I'll talk about qualifications in a couple of minutes' time. But then, so arts and cultural workers, a bit more likely to be 25 to 34 category, a bit less likely to be in the 50 to 64 category or the 65 plus category. And those patterns are almost identical in the West Midlands and in other parts of the country. By contrast, again, it won't come as a surprise to anyone in this room that the West Midlands is more ethnically diverse than the rest of England and Wales on average. So in other parts of the country, about 4% of arts and cultural workers are Asian. In the West Midlands, that number is about 6%. However, in the West Midlands, about 12% of people, and for clarity, this is people in work. When you bring in under 18s, these numbers look a little bit different. About 12% of the working population in the West Midlands, about 12 of those people are Asian, compared with about 8% of the rest of the country. And so the percentages of people who are arts and cultural workers who are Asian in the West Midlands is about half of the equivalent figure for the rest of the workforce. This pattern echoes the general pattern in the country, where people who are Asian are about half as likely to be in arts and cultural jobs as in other jobs. Looking at other ethnic groups, people in the West Midlands, so people who are of mixed or multiple ethnicities are actually a little bit more likely to be in arts and cultural jobs compared with other jobs. Those patterns are pretty similar in the West Midlands relative to the rest of the country. So just to reiterate, the differences that we see in terms of ethnic group, where Asian people in particular are less likely to be in arts and cultural jobs than in other jobs, that is a similar pattern as is seen in other parts of the country. And it is a relatively similar story in terms of religion. This slide's a little bit more complicated, so I'll spend a little bit longer talking about it. On the left-hand side, we have the percentages of people who are Christian, who report being Christian, who report no religion, and who didn't answer the question about religion. On the right-hand side, we have the equivalent figures for people who said they were Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, other religion, or Sikh. And that's in two halves because the numbers on the left-hand side are very big. So I wanted to put it this way so it was a little easier to interpret. And this is a similar story. I'll draw attention to two sets of bars here. First one is people who report no religion. In other parts of England and Wales, the percentages of people in arts and cultural jobs who report no religion is about 56%. In the West Midlands, that number is a little bit smaller, 49%. But, and you'll hear me say this a lot, this is reflective of the general patterns in the West Midlands as compared with the rest of the country, where fewer people in the West Midlands report no religion than elsewhere. People working in arts and cultural jobs are more likely to report no religion than people in other jobs, but the difference that we see between the West Midlands and elsewhere is pretty similar. The other group that I want to draw attention to is people who say they're Muslim, where about 10% of people working in other jobs in the West Midlands report being Muslim, compared with 4% of people in arts and cultural jobs. So that's a difference of about 2.5, or about 40%. By contrast, in the other parts of the country, about 6% of people in other jobs are Muslim, compared with 2% of people in arts and cultural jobs. So people in the West Midlands who are Muslim are less likely to be doing arts and cultural jobs than other jobs, to a similar extent as is seen in other parts of the country. People in arts and cultural jobs are much more likely to hold a level 4 qualification. That is something like a degree or some other bit of higher education, than in other parts of the country. In the West Midlands, you're looking at about 64%, compared with about 71% elsewhere. But again, people in the West Midlands are a bit less likely to hold degrees than people in other parts of the country. Once again, this is an effect that is largely driven by London, where lots more people have degrees than in other parts of the country. This one is the one that I'm really interested in. So again, people might remember when they were completing the census, they were asked the number of hours that they were working. People working in arts and cultural jobs in general are more likely to be working part-time. It's worth reinforcing here that the census took place in the spring of 2021, which was a period where lots of people were, their patterns of work in the spring of 2021 look quite different from the patterns of work in other periods. So I wouldn't read too much into the fact that a lot more creative workers were working part-time, and particularly were working not necessarily very many hours. But so if you have a look on the right-hand side, looking at people working in all other jobs, people's likelihood of working 49 plus hours, 31 through to 48 hours, 16 to 30 hours, or 15 hours or fewer, those numbers are pretty much identical in the West Midlands and in other parts of the country. For arts and cultural jobs, that's not true. So 54% of people in other parts of the country were working 31 hours plus. For people in the West Midlands, that number is 48%. And that's not an enormous difference, but it's not nothing either. And I think it's worth unpacking what might be driving these differences. It might just be a pandemic effect, where in the West Midlands, it was more difficult to be getting full-time hours because of structural differences in the occupational sectors, but that might not be the case anymore. But I think that's definitely one that I would encourage people to keep an eye on. To just draw together a few other things, again, people in the West Midlands, much more likely, people working in arts and cultural jobs in the spring of 2021 were much more likely to be working from home than people in other jobs. People in the West Midlands, slightly less likely, but with a pattern that repeats itself both for arts and cultural workers and people in other jobs. People in arts and cultural jobs mostly said that they had very good or good health, almost identical patterns in the West Midlands and in other parts of the country. People in arts and cultural jobs, so this one's quite interesting actually. People in arts and cultural jobs roughly as likely overall to have dependent children as people in other jobs. In the West Midlands, people are a little bit, the arts and cultural workers of the West Midlands are a little bit more likely to have dependent children than people in other parts of the country. Don't want to read too much into this. It's not a big difference, but it's not nothing either. Just the last couple to flag here in relation to people's housing situation. People in arts and cultural jobs are more likely to be in the private rented sector, less likely to be in the social rented sector. In the West Midlands, we're looking at about 27% of people private rented, compared with 7% of people social rented, again, of people working in arts and cultural jobs. But similarly, people working in arts and cultural jobs in general, a little bit more likely to be in private rented. I am pretty sure that the thing that is driving this is that thing that I showed you earlier, where people working in arts and cultural jobs are more likely to be in the 25 to 34 age group, where being in private rented is much more common. The housing deprivation, these are things like whether your house is overcrowded, whether you have central heating or not. People in arts and cultural jobs, a little bit less likely to be in different forms of housing deprivation, with no real differences between different parts of the country. But all of this varies enormously by local authority. What I cannot tell you is whether the arts and cultural workers of, let's say, Redditch are more likely to be in housing deprivation or not. But I can tell you whether the people of Redditch are more likely to be in housing deprivation or not. Based on what we've seen so far, the patterns are pretty consistently that the differences that we see between arts and cultural workers of the West Midlands and elsewhere are driven by differences between the West Midlands and elsewhere. That's not uniformly the case, but it's mostly the case. And so the work that we've been doing draws attention to some of these differences between local authorities in a bit more detail. I'm going to show you a horrible screen grab that I promise will look more beautiful when the project is concluded. So this shows us how the percentages of people in different arts and cultural jobs in each of the local authorities of the West Midlands varies, and all consistently benchmarked against the national average. So anything in orange is below average, anything in green is above average, anything in a rich green a lot above average, and so on. So, for example, Stratford-on-Avon has quite a lot of people working in photography, audiovisual, broadcasting equipment occupations. You will see equivalents to this for all of the other plots that I've shown you as well. So, for example, if you're interested in the percentages of households in each of the local authorities for the West Midlands that have got dependent children, that is what you will find. So, in a sec, I will hand over to Anthony, but I just want to reiterate the point that this is part of an ongoing bit of practice. We are really, really keen to get feedback on anything that we may have already shown, and also anything that we may have not already shown. If you found yourself thinking, oh, there was something that I really thought that we would find out about, and this hasn't been included, that might be because it's impossible, and I can, if that is the case, I can probably talk a little bit about why that is. Or it might be that it is possible, in which case we will do our best to make it happen as we continue. I will throw to Anthony to tell you a little bit more about the next steps, and then we can go into a bit of a discussion.
Cool, Brill. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for going through. I mean, people can see there's quite an expansive amount of data there. Let me just remove that spotlight so everyone can see each other. Yeah, there's a lot to go through. There's a lot to reflect on, and I think one of the things with the data that we're really aware of actually is that we've done this piece of work. We've started to look at it. We want to look at it with all the kind of the partners and the organisations around the table as well. But actually, some of the working with the data really requires kind of nuance and understanding it in your place or in your context or in your art form. And really, there's kind of a lot of also analysis and an interpretation that kind of needs to happen as well. That's kind of informed by individual organisations' priorities as well. I'm going to pop in this is my personal plug, because I think we're talking a lot at the moment about workforce and skills, and I think it's important to kind of reference that there's a lot of work that's been going on about this already. There's a lot of work that we're trying to do as an organisation around this, and actually I think within the region as well, that we want to support. But I do really love this quote, so I'm putting it in the chat. It's from a literature review on current recruitment challenges and skills needs for the creative and cultural sectors. This was by CC Skills in 2023. Like the tone of it, and I think the language in it is we've seen in plenty of reports from the past few decades, and I think also we're seeing it again now, and we're seeing the kind of the current narrative on skills needs for the sector kind of being spoken about again. But I think it is just important to say with this piece of work and with the workforce strategy, we're really trying to think about how do we start to make some change actually within the sector. This quote kind of points to actually lots about projects and programs, and what we're really interested in is looking at this in terms of the system and in terms of the West Midlands as a region, really. as well as supporting organisations to think about kind of what they need from their workforce, but also the types of change that is required also through these programs. So in terms of some of the next steps for us, we are going to be pulling all of this kind of into a report, and we'd love to hear some questions and comments from you about, kind of what's needed. And we'll also be releasing and making kind of the data that sits behind this available to you as well. We know, for example, already that a number of compacts in the region are really keen to kind of get their hands on this data and work on it to understand it in their place. So that will all be available. But we also wanted to make, just a bit of space and time available today for people to kind of ask some questions, unpick it, and help us refine what we need to put out into the world as well. So I'll pass over to people for any questions. If you can raise your hand, and we'll take a question or maybe two questions at a time as well, if that's okay. So Marcus, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Thanks for that, Mark. I mean, there was a huge amount of data there, all fantastic stuff. And apologies if you did say it and I missed it. But you've cross-referenced with many metrics there, including religion, and there was one around people's health. Now, is there a cross-reference for disability for those who identify as disabled, and how many of those are split across the cultural workforce?
Give me a sec to have a look. So disability has quite a precise measurement. I'm just going to I tell you what, why don't we take a couple of questions while I look that up?
It always scares me when Mark does this, because I'm like, the way that Mark's brain works and we'll be able to instantly find something is quite amazing. But so the pressure's on. Lara, sorry, you've got your hand up. Hello.
Yeah, hi Mark. I mean, he knows what I'm going to say because we do it on every single panel that I'm on with him. I mean, it's not a huge surprise, and I think it's really interesting seeing this regionally because we did the panel last year on national figures, wasn't it, Mark? And none of it's changed. But I think it's in fact, the West Midlands is slightly better than I thought it was going to be. I think there is a really interesting thing about, I would just put it in the chat actually, about there's going to be a difference across regions, across the region. So if you look at the Shropshire Herefordshire border, there's an age correlation there about where people are. And I think the really important thing is every time I see this data done badly, it's because the interpretation of the lens is wrong. So it's always done as, and Noel will probably say the same thing if he was here, it's always done as a gap. So this is the sector, which is very white, heteronormative, blah, 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 in an ever-decreasing audiences and marketplace. But outside that formal education is a huge amount of skills. There's lots of people that are Asian particularly that work in this sector, but not through the formalised thing that would be captured in this data. And we know that, Anthony, we've talked about this at length. But so I think there's something really important that it's not about how do we get more people of colour into the workforce, because it just drives me insane. And also it's an assumption that this is the best place to work in. It's systemically, the West Midlands and particularly Birmingham, as we all know, I think about that, is completely unequal because I wouldn't have to deal with so many people that are burnt out talking to me about it otherwise. And also people go outside this sector. So I do a little bit of work in Birmingham, but the rest of it is national. So how do you capture all of that? And so I just think it's how you frame it, and we don't look at it through a deficit lens. There's the usual cultural stuff is we have to put it in the context of the census data because the demographic shifts in Birmingham particularly are massively different to where they were 10 years ago. And if you put that in line with future workforce, for example, if you talk to some of the universities about the much more ethnically diverse student body, for example, in the School of Art, but that's to do with the generational social mobility shifts within certain ethnic demographics. So I think just because some of the work we are doing in Birmingham is that there's a real opportunity to get this right and not just do the same old, because it will just be, one, I'll just moan about it on LinkedIn again, and two, it does a disservice to the region, because the reason we are nowhere near as strong as other regions is because we're not getting it right in terms of how we interpret it, and we're still looking at, if you actually looked at the employment figures compared to the staticness of the arts organisations in this city, for example, which have not grown substantially compared to Lancashire had a 25% increase in MPAs. We have still got the same people and a few diverse-led organisations. And I think we don't have the workforce for the cities that we have in the region. So I think this is a chance to sort of say, maybe we've got to have some ownership from the sector itself, because it never does anything about it.
Yeah. No, that all like I know. I mean, you've spoken about those points, and Mark, and I know you've probably got a few things to say. But I was just remembering the like as part of this, the first phase of the research project that was done a couple of years ago, and I've got the numbers in front of me now. So there were at that point 5,500 students in cultural FE courses, 39% of them from ethnically diverse backgrounds. And that's definitely not replicated within the sector, and it's what's happening, with HE courses, and I think really right to point out the porousness of actually what work in the sector means and how people are doing that. And actually it stretches far beyond that, in the same way that actually the research data that we're looking at does look at place and has got like quite neat local authority boundaries around it. But actually, if you're working in Birmingham, you may well be going off and doing bits of work in Stoke or down in Worcester or wherever else across the region as well. So it's I think for us the census data kind of gives us some stuff to look at, but it is that interpretation and analysis and thinking about actually what is the lived experience of people that are here in the region as well.
Yeah. And if you add in the Creative Peck data around the cultural participation, which is absolutely hilarious when you read it, because obviously Solihull and Warwickshire and Herefordshire are much higher, but then they can actually link it to National Trust properties, because you've got more kind of National Trust properties in those, as somebody who's on the regional council. And I think that's actually really important, because the National Trust get far better ethnicity data relevant to those places than arts organisations do. So, I mean, I'm just saying, Mark, you heard me say this a million times, so you know what I'm talking about. But I just think there's a reason we are missing, well, we are lagging so far behind, and why, when I talk to people of colour, particularly in this, and I get a lot of that, it's not to work here. I get paid half of what I pay, what my fee is outside Birmingham, sorry, not the region, but and I think those things are quite important, because if you're looking at economically, where would you sit? You wouldn't necessarily register. I've been advised by somebody in a public body to register in Manchester as a company.
And those structural issues are real problems for the region, aren't they? Like that's totally right. Mark, shall I give you a second to respond to both
Yeah,
Lara
so
and Marcus,
I'll
and
start
then
with the earlier question from Marcus so that I
Mark
don't forget it.
the Mark will come to you in a second. Sorry.
Yeah. So we didn't give you a slide on disability, but you can have that. I don't know if I imagine in a room full of people like this, you have all spent quite a lot of time completing equalities monitoring forms. And if that describes you, then you might remember that the question that you were asked is whether you have a long-term physical or mental health condition, and if so, whether this affects your day-to-day life a lot, a little, or not at all. And so we can start looking at that on that basis. So 2 unconnected stream of consciousness points in response to Lara. I don't think I've raised either of these 2 to you before, so there is going to be at least some new material here. One of the downsides of the way that I presented the data here is that it doesn't include anything about where people were working. That's partly a census thing, but it's also partly a pandemic thing, where I think the extent to which you're able to capture people's work locations in 2021 is not necessarily representative of what things look like before or since. And so what I was describing was people who live in West Midlands local authorities, who said, in response to the question about what kind of job they do, selected one of the categories described. It doesn't follow from that they're working in the West Midlands. We don't know. And for I mentioned at the start, I don't know anything about the West Midlands, so I won't try to read anything into that. Try that again. The second thing that I would say is I always get a bit nervous when people talk about differences between current cultural workforce and people who are currently in sort of studying in cultural programs, cultural education, cultural HE, and so on. Because and you wouldn't do this, but one of the things that sometimes people hear when this is flagged is a sense of, oh, just wait 10 years and it will be fine. We've got this new generation coming up. They look completely different. They're really great. They're really energetic. They've got loads of ideas. They will sort out all of our problems. And that I've heard that before, and it's never happened. So because actually the relationship between cultural HE and cultural work is a little bit more porous, a little bit looser than is described there, which isn't to criticize cultural HE. If people enjoy studying arts and culture in higher education, and then they go on to do a job that has nothing to do with that, but that they love, that's a brilliant outcome. But I think it's something that we need to stay on top of and really look quite closely at how many of the creative grads from the West Midlands are going on into creative roles in the West Midlands.
Mark, ready for your question. Sorry it's taken a while to get to you as well.
No, it's quite all right. I've just got three observations, really. Not so much of a question, but obviously, as you mentioned, this was March 2021, so obviously it was the height of the pandemic. So has there been any mitigation in perhaps people perhaps in the numbers of people working in the arts and cultural sector and creative industries who perhaps at that point in time were not working in the arts and cultural sector and creative industries because of obviously not being furloughed but being made redundant? We know there was huge redundancies at the back end of 2020 particularly in the sector that obviously affected where people worked and where they went. So has there been any mitigation in that? I only say because in Coventry, I know from the data from the census, simply our population figure was 345,000 at the point of the 2021 census. However, the mid-year estimate before that was around 379,000, so quite a big difference. And when we did some digging around the numbers with ONS, particularly, we found that there was probably an undercount in Coventry due to displacement, mainly from the student population due to the pandemic. So I was just wondering if there's any particular mitigation around that. And also, is there any, because at the time of the census, we have to remember that the West Midlands was in the preparation of hosting City of Culture. It was in the preparation of the Festival 2022, Commonwealth Games. So, and obviously we know from those major interventions, there was a huge surge of employment, which then goes away once those events are over. So is there any potential that they are reflected in some of the numbers being presented here?
So the short answer is we don't know. My instinct is that it is easy to overstate the impact of short-term interventions, and it is easy to overstate the effects of, when there is a major program of work going on, people moving, people leaving. Because in my limited expertise on this, not as many people move as you would think. Certainly when I spent I spent a lot of my life for my sins on the cross-country train, and in the period around a lot of these major events taking place, they definitely felt lively and I saw a lot of lanyards. So my instinct is that that might not have been as profound as it could have been, but I don't know. The other thing that I would say in relation to, like sort of potential pandemic effects is that, so again, we don't know. My instinct is that actually redundancy is not as big of a part of the story as it could be, reflecting the very large numbers of people working in arts and cultural jobs who are freelancers. Being made redundant is actually maybe less profound of an effect in the data in terms of people just not getting work and then pivoting to something else. And one of the big things that we've seen since the census took place is a real drop in the number of people, the number of film and TV productions. I don't know if that's how that manifested itself in the West Midlands, but anecdotally, you hear quite a lot about people working in high-end film and TV who are pivoting into something else. So it's possible that the sort of potential pandemic recovery is also met with other more negative things happening, and also potential pandemic scarring effects where people left the sector and didn't come back.
Oh, sorry, Lara, I can see you've got your hand up as well. Oh, you're on mute. And if anyone else has got any questions, I know we've got about 8 minutes left, so do feel free to pop your hand up or pop them in the chat as well.
Well, yeah, just to agree with Mark again, so that's a given anyway. But he's like, yeah, whatever. But also, yeah, the thing to add in is actually about industry trends. So if you look at high-end TV in particular, I was thinking about this today because obviously the level of redundancy in that sector since lockdown because of the overcommissioning and also the pivoting. I mean, I know people that work in this region actually who are really high level and they haven't worked for 9 months because of the because also the impact of streaming and how that's kind of disrupting the commissioning model. So I think there's that to be done, and also you could see we did this during the Commonwealth Games, the number of people that left the sector in terms of cultural production. So you had a certain age group that aged out, so now you've got this massive gap of people that when every time I need to find somebody at that level, because there's not been that level of investment and budgets and to play with, you haven't got that level of experience and expertise. So I think there is an impact that's quite that you can see quite dramatically in high-end TV, for example, and because the whole sector's changed, but also even in terms of cultural production and producers, because where do people get the experience in order to say, well, I've done X, Y, Z, if you haven't had that level of budget for the last 5 years? So I think there is something about, again, that's what I mean, Anthony, about not filling in the gap, because there's a gap, but also there had to be capacity built in a way that's meaningful, because we can't just develop a load of producers when there won't be some budgets. Somebody was talking about public realm to me at the weekend, and I went, and they said, how do we get local authorities to commission more public art? And I thought, well, they might have some other priorities at the moment, than public art. So I think it has to be quite manageable what we're doing as well.
Yeah, and actually, sorry, just reminded me of another piece of work. I can't remember if it's 2023 that the Work Foundation did, looking at precarious work in the regions as well, actually. And I think in the West Midlands, the cultural sector, again, we talk about jobs in the sector and wanting to support people into them, but actually, we're the second most precarious kind of sector in the region in terms of workforce, just underneath accommodation and food services, and that's based on low 0 hours contracts, low pay, lots of different indicators. So actually, the sector is quite a challenging place to work at times as well. And exactly what types of jobs should we be having and should we be promising to people, and what's the need for it, I suppose, as well. Tracy, I can see you've got your hand up. Sorry.
Yeah, hi. I can you hear me?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah. Hi. I just wanted to say I'm a freelance actor and involved with our trade union Equity, and I just kind of wanted to say the vast majority of us are freelance. And Laura mentioned doctors, and I've lots of friends who are crew and lots of friends who are Back2 members, and we've been really, really, really affected by that. And basically 400 free, guest leading acting roles have disappeared per annum with the loss of doctors. Now, obviously, not everybody's booked who lives in the West Midlands for that, but a lot of us were, and that's suddenly gone. And the kind of Birmingham City Council has 100% cuts, as you know, and that's happened recently. And it is really hard to carry on being a freelance actor or crew member or like worker with the loss of doctors, with the underfunding by the BBC of our region, with Birmingham City Council funding cuts, and yeah, and an awful lot of actors who live in the West Midlands region. If you go and look at their Spotlight page, which is a thing we all advertise in, we quite often they'll say they're based. You have a choice of where you can say you're based, and they will put London first, and they will sleep in their cars. And my agent just sacked me because I wouldn't lie and say I had a base in London, because I don't have a base in London. So, and that's not going to be in your statistics, but I just thought I'd tell you that.
No, thank you, Tracy, and thanks for sharing that. So I think it is, and it's one of those points that we were making. Like I think quite often and across this work, actually, we do look at there is a temptation to see sort of the big data stuff as being the only part of this picture, and I think it is that specific context relevant to different sectors or places and other forms of data and insight that we can bring in alongside that to make the case for this type of work. Although this is kind of like one big piece of data work, I think there is a lot that kind of sits around this as well that draws on other types of research and experiences of people in the sector as well, that gives it kind of that richness that we need to kind of make the case and to kind of do the advocacy work that is kind of quite important for us as a sector at the moment as well, and particularly in the region here at the moment, as like you pointed to some of the challenges with local authorities as well. I think we're all starting to feel that in this space. Mark, on that, actually, I don't know if there's anything you want to say that maybe speaks to that a little bit about how we might find out more about I think Mark Scott's kind of put a question in the chat as well about mobility between sectors and people moving places as well. And I think that kind of builds on Tracy's point about needing to be in places like London or Manchester for work. I don't know if there's anything you can add.
So it's a little tricky. One of the things that the census includes is, so after it asks you, where do you live? There's also a follow-up question of, is this the same place that you lived a year ago? And if the answer is no, then people can be asked about where that was. And so, for example, it would be possible to have a look at if people are reporting that they're working as actors, for example. You wouldn't just have to look at the West Midlands, you look at the whole country and say, is it more likely that people who say that they're actors have moved from the West Midlands compared with having moved to the West Midlands? Which, if I was looking at a census other than the 2021 one, I would feel like was potentially quite interesting and useful data. With the pandemic context, I would be a little bit more circumspect about how much we could read into that.
Well, I'm aware that it's almost time for us to finish, so I should probably start to wrap up a little bit. I think, yeah, thank you to Mark for doing this work, and thank you all for your questions as well. It's really helpful just as we start to think about getting this out into the sector and getting people to be able to use it as well. And I'm really minded actually of Lara's comment as well about it's not just about kind of seeing the data, it's about thinking about the change that organizations need to make and how that kind of needs to be operationalized, really, like, what's going to be happening with this stuff and how do we start to act on some of this as a region. Do you know what, Lara? I can see you've put your hand up, so I'll let you have the last words.
Actually, I think it was a legacy hand. However, I always have something
Okay.
to say. But no, actually, just to add to that, there's some hard decisions, actually, that if you're going to produce this and who is it for, because Culture Central can't respond to all of it. And just thinking about Tracy's point, actually, is it might be that there are priorities for skills strategy going forwards, because if you haven't got the industry and the supply chain here, which we haven't in certain sectors, it might be that there has to be a focus on, it can't just be let's have a skills strategy for the whole of the region, because it's not going to work like that. And it's certainly not economically going to be where we look at that alongside some of the inclusive growth stuff with the green paper for the Combined Authority and all that kind of stuff.
No, exactly. And I know there's people in the room actually, so Laura and Rob
Can
as
I
well, that
just
are
jump
helping with
in?
the
Sorry.
workforce strategy. Yeah,
Sorry.
sure. Sorry, Tracy, give me
Really,
1
really,
second,
really
because
quickly.
just if anyone does need to go, please do feel free to go, but we'll stop the recording now as well. And Tracy, I'll let you ask your question now. Sorry.
Yeah,